Liz is most appropriately moderating the program, Central America, Charting a Path to Prosperity at Home. She is a graduate of St. Louis University and has spent over 10 years living or working in Central America. Liz, please.
Thanks, Pierce. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Central America, Charting a Path to Prosperity at Home, focused on the countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. We're very grateful to you all for joining us to discuss this important issue. As we all know, migration from Central America is a topic that has garnered much attention in the media over the past years and increasingly in these past few months. It's a complicated, challenging issue with no immediate solutions. As Pierce mentioned, at the World Affairs Council, one of our goals is to encourage continuous global dialogue. We know that the issue of migration from Central America and migration globally is something that cannot be addressed or solved from one lens alone. We're proud to bring together various perspectives that encourage us all to think deeper and to work to understand better by listening more. In that vein, it is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speakers, Mr. Eduardo Nunez and Dr. Tom Hare. Mr. Nuñez and Dr. Hare have worked together for the past 5 years to promote human rights in Central America and are part of a Central American Research Alliance at the University of Notre Dame. One important item to note before we get into introductions. At the end of the presentations, we'll have some time for a question and answer period. If you have questions during the webinar for the presenters, please type them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. If you have technical questions or need logistical help, please type that in the chat. Our first speaker is Eduardo Nunez. Mr. Nuñez is the National Democratic Institute's resident director in Guatemala and also the director of their regional Central American program. Previously, Mr. Nuñez served from 2002 to 2006 as General Coordinator of the Organization of American States Program on Democratic Values and Political Management in Guatemala, as well as their program on institutional strengthening and governance with the Guatemalan Congress. He served for 8 years as Director of Electoral Technical Assistance Programs for the Center for Electoral Assistance and Promotion for the Inter-American Institute of Human Rights. Mr. Nuñez holds a degree in political science from the University of Costa Rica and has completed graduate studies in development projects and is currently a PhD candidate in public management at the Central American Institute of Public Administration. Born in Costa Rica, Mr. Nuñez has spoken in over 15 countries in the Americas and Europe. Following Mr. Nuñez, we have Dr. Tom Hare from the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Hare is a senior associate with the Pulte Institute for Global Development in the Keough School of Global Affairs at the university. He develops, implements, and evaluates international development programs with a focus on rule of law and human rights in Central America. His experience in design, implementation, and evaluation of international development programs includes work funded by the Department of State, the U.S. Agency for International Development, the United Nations, corporations, and private donors. He is the author of a book, Zonas Peligrosas, about the challenge of creating safe neighborhoods in Central America, as well as several peer-reviewed book chapters and articles. Dr. Hare holds a master's in development management and policy from Georgetown University and a PhD in public policy analysis from St. Louis University. Dr. Hare has lived and/or worked in Central America for over 15 years. Dr. Hare's interest in the region began in El Salvador, where he first spent time listening and learning about the daily reality of Salvadorans in a small town outside of San Salvador. We're proud to have these two speakers with us here today and look forward to hearing their thoughts. Mr. Nuñez, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Liz. It's a really pleasure for me to be here to share some thoughts, ideas, perspectives, points of view about the Central American situation and the main trends to try to understand what we can do from the optic of the regional and international cooperation in general. Please, the next slide, please. Thank you. My presentation have at this moment in 3 parts. The first one is try to respond one question: where did we come from? Is a little retrospective about Central America since the transition of democracy 40 years ago. The second part is most focused on the current situation, the political and democratic situation at this moment in the 6 countries of the Central American region, with particular emphasis on on Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, the northern triangle of Central America. And the third part, which I try to share with you some main trends to try to see the next steps in the historical evolution of Central America from the political and democratic side. Let's go with the presentation. Central America, 40 years ago, made the option of transitioning from authoritarian regimes to democracy in the context of the third global democratization wave. But a more comprehensive historical look indicates that in reality, Central America experienced 4 simultaneous transitions of the political regime, of the state model, of the economic model, and from war to peace. The first one, the political transition, is the best known and refers to the option of holding elections and promoting free play by political parties and to defend human rights to guarantee the alternation of power, the main point of the electoral democracy functioning. The second transition, the economic, refers to the process of opening the Central American economies to international markets, replacing the previous approach of closed economies and emphasis on domestic markets. The third transition of the state model identifies a tendency to reduce institutional capacities to regulate the economy and to distribute wealth. Is the Washington consensus in general perspective. And the last one, the fourth transition from war to peace, is, from my point of view, the most decisive transition because it established a new way of resolving internal conflicts and regional conflicts between countries in Central America. This set of transitions generates a contradiction of origin. While the political, economic, and war to peace transition increases the demand for state policies and service, the state model transitions reduce these capacities. It's a very big contradiction. It's like to try to make democracy without state, without strong institutions in Central America. And if there is a lesson learned in contemporary political history in Latin America, it is that democracy requires strong states, strong institutions. Next, please, Lorna. This set of political, economic, and social processes explains why we are as we are in Central America. But in addition, it shows certain design and process limits that I want to share with you. First, the transition was like a daughter of agreements of economic, political, and military elites in Central America. These elites' agreements no longer represent contemporary social reality. The new societies in Central America are more complex, more diverse, more contradictory. In short, more plural in terms of the number and the variety of actors that make them. For this reason, the transition agreements between elites are not sustainable in this new context and need to be reestablished from a broad and plural perspective. Second, the state models do not represent the new Central America societies and do not have at this moment the capacities to respond to their interests. In some cases, institutions has been created and developed behind the backs of the publics, behind the backs of the citizens, with which they have been losing social support sustainably in the last years. Third, this raises the dilemma of how to continue expanding democracy with that kind of states that are weak, insufficient, and at times co-opted by factual, legal, or illegal powers. And finally, this explains why the multiple transitions that I described before, listed before, are considered to be unfinished transitions with also an uncertain future. Next, please. In this general context, Central America shows different phases. For institutional, security, migratory, and economic reasons, we have at least two subregions realities. The countries of the north of Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, which show higher levels of insecurity, limited economic diversification, high degrees of social inequality, and high irregular migratory flows. On the other hand, the southern countries, Costa Rica and Panama especially, show more diversified economies, better international insertion, less migration, and lower levels of public insecurity. In the middle of both realities, Nicaragua shows limited economic diversification, high level of poverty and inequality, but less insecurity, public insecurity, than the all other Central American countries. And on the immigration side, has high level of immigration, but not to the United States, but to Costa Rica. Next, please. The 6 Central American countries faces several common challenges. Let me list you 4 main challenges in common for the 6 countries. First, the growth of the organized crime, its transformation or mutation capacities, and the increased capacities of these organized crime groups to control territories and functional areas of the state's institutions. Second, the growing corruption phenomenon, which acts as a corrosive factor that impacts democracy and the quality of the government's policies and services. Third, a difficult governance in reason of an institutional limits, changes in process in the party regimes, the emergence of new actors, outsiders, and the loss of confidence and satisfactions with democracy. And fourth, as a key internal factor always present in Central America, the geopolitical influence and the agenda of the United States of America in the region. Next, please. There are some data on political culture that explain the political and democratic evolution in the region. Next. For example, on support of democracy, 3 of the 6 countries, with the exception of Costa Rica, Panama, and Nicaragua, show low level of support to democracy in comparison in general with Latin American average. El Salvador shows 55%, Honduras 51%, and Guatemala 48%. Next. In relation with satisfaction with democracy, with the exception of Nicaragua and Costa Rica, the other countries have low level of satisfaction with democracy. Honduras, 29%, Panama and Guatemala, 26%, and El Salvador, 15%. Overall below the Latin American average, 30%. Next. On the side of the key institutional support, a regional average showed that the main political institutions in the whole Latin America, and particularly in Central America, are in the last places of the comparative exercise. Political parties with 50% and Congress with 22% are the worst evaluated political and democratic institutions in Central America and in general in Latin America by people. Next, please. To go to the end to my presentation, I want to take a quick look about the main regional trends for the next 4 or 5 years in the region. First, we are witness at this moment, and probably in the next years, a regressive threats to human rights and democracy, with some kind of authoritarian turn in some countries, particularly in the north of Central America and Nicaragua. Second, the dilemma over the impact, the organized crime and corruption networks, refer to the debate over the capture, co-optation, and maybe in some places or territories, the symbiosis between crime, politics, and public institutions of the state. Third, the trend towards social fragmentation and its growing impact on the governance problem and challenges in the whole countries of Central America. Fourth, the loss of a strength of politics. We are in the middle of transformations of the whole party systems in the 6 countries in Central America, with uncertain future for the whole. And finally, the erosion of the political and social dialogue capacities in the whole countries to build new agreements between social, economic, and political actors on strategic reform agendas on democratic and governance challenges. Thank you.
Thanks, Eduardo, and thanks to the World Affairs Council for this invitation. I want to take us from the macro level that Eduardo has so masterfully described, down to how this all plays out at the individual level when Central Americans are determining whether or not to migrate. First, however, let's make sure we understand the phenomenon of migration from the region. Here we show the migration trends overall as measured by apprehensions of undocumented individuals at the southwestern border of the United States. This includes those migrating from Mexico and elsewhere. So it's especially worth noting that 98% of apprehensions in 2000, for example, were from Mexico versus just 20% by 2019. There are also twice as many Border Patrol agents now as there were in 2000. So presumably there's a higher percentage of apprehensions now. We just need to consider these trends in that context. You can note from the graph on the left that peaks and valleys in migration are nothing new, though you wouldn't know it based on the news cycles alone. We see increases in the mid-1980s during economic austerity measures in Mexico, wars in Guatemala and El Salvador, and unaddressed inequality and poverty in Honduras. We see spikes again after peace treaties in 1992 and 1996, and a substantial drop after about 2005 as the global recession started to take hold. On the right, in 2019, unaccompanied minors jump as the first caravans start to leave from the region, which reduces cost and risk for this group. On top of poverty, violence, and other issues we will discuss, family reunification is important to understand among this group. Children of those that migrated around 2000 are now about 15 to 25 years old and themselves are migrating. Young adults who migrated in the 1980s are now aging and want to bring their families to themselves. I suspect that this trend would have continued in 2020 had it not been for the pandemic. I think the increase we are seeing now is really just a continuation of what started in 2019, plus pent-up demand from the past year. The point here is that even though we are seeing a potential peak, apprehensions are actually much lower than overall in the past half century. Next slide. So why do people migrate, especially these youth? The so-called root causes we typically hear about are lack of jobs, violence, and reuniting with their family. For example, here we asked this question of young Hondurans who said they intended to migrate in the next 3 years in a U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID program. Here we can see where reasons for wanting to migrate change among the same population even within a year's time. This shows how it's not just one issue, but multiple interrelated issues, and that they change in a relatively short period of time. For example, nearly 20% more cited safety as the reason for wanting to migrate in the follow-up than they did in the baseline study. This means that in response, we can't just have a jobs program alone or a violence prevention program alone, because even if the situation improves in one area, it might get worse in another. Another challenge, as Eduardo noted, is that the countries in the region are not the same. Research by others shows that Guatemalans migrate more for economic reasons, and Salvadorans and Hondurans migrate more to escape violence. Next slide. So how do we respond to this desire to migrate and enforce the laws at the same time? Currently, we do it in 4 main ways. The first pathway is the legal pathway, where we allow a certain number of temporary workers in sectors in need. Traditionally, this has been much higher for migrants coming from Mexico than from Central America, but the number has recently doubled from Central America allowed to work temporarily in the United States. The second pathway is a humanitarian pathway. These are individuals that come through temporary protected status after such things as hurricanes or large-scale events in their countries. And there's also the open asylum and refugee application system, which we've heard a lot about recently as well. Finally, or third, is the enforcement pathway. We've also heard a lot about this, about investment in border protection and deportation from within the United States. The fourth pathway is development. And these are all the social, economic, political, and human areas that we attempt to address in countries in Central America. And we do this mostly through civil society or private groups. I'll be focusing my presentation on this development area. So what does all this cost? As you can see here, the biggest cost is, as is well known, the enforcement at the border at $26 billion per year. The development costs are actually much lower at only $1 billion per year. It's important to note that investment in development has a great potential to reduce the other 3 by decreasing the need to migrate. It may be inconvenient, but a long view is required here. In the meantime, we need policies in the other pathways that recognize that this is a cyclical issue and it will likely repeat again over the next few decades. Next slide. We should also keep in mind that the total development assistance for the region is less than 2% of the total foreign request for the State Department and Agency for International Development for the next fiscal year. And total foreign aid, as you see here, is less than 1% of the anticipated federal budget. So in terms of development assistance to the region, we're talking about less than 1/10 of 1% of the US federal budget as an investment in the region that could decrease expenses for enforcement by billions in the coming years. Next slide. So within the development pathway to respond to migration, we tend to group efforts or programs into the following general categories that respond to the root causes. For economic development, we try to create jobs and provide training for individuals to fill those jobs. Some programs also work on entrepreneurship and small business development. For violence prevention, we try to increase capacity to investigate and prosecute violent criminals and increase adherence to the rule of law. This is all fine and necessary, but it has been done before. The latest attempt from 2016 to 2020 was called the Alliance for Prosperity, and it was a $19 billion investment by the United States, the Inter-American Development Bank, and regional governments. We will see where there was some progress during this time on economic and violence indicators, yet migration continues. At the Pulte Institute, we look from an integral human development perspective that examines not just root causes, but interrelated factors, and recognizes that even individual reasons for migrating might change given time and context. All of the above led us to examine individuals more closely. Why is it that some people migrate and others don't when exposed to the same realities and when the traditional root causes might even be improving? I will get to that, but let me show trends on the first two bullets where we do see some improvement. Next slide, thanks. First, on the economic development front, we see where GDP per capita has actually increased over the past 15 years, though it is still about a quarter or a third of the regional average. Rates of poverty and inequality are improving as well, but are still higher on average than the region. Exports are more or less stable over the past 10 years and either in line or above Latin American averages. Importantly, research by others has shown that these positive development trends can themselves lead to an increased migration for a time, before leveling off and then decreasing. Rising incomes, more education, and better health lead people to have the means, awareness, and ability to migrate. However, once they reach a certain threshold, migration begins to decline. For now, all these are going in a good direction with the ways to go to get to the regional average. So this would suggest there's not just the economy that explains increased migration in the past couple of years. Next slide. The second variable we'll look at is violence, where the most common measure is the homicide rate per 100,000 people. We see substantial decreases in homicides, especially in the past 5 years, despite an impunity rate of over 90% in all three countries. There are many reasons for this improvement, but overall, this is good news, even if rates remain higher than the Latin American average of 17.1 and well above the global average of 6.1. So here again, we see an improving situation regarding the root cause, yet migration continues. So we ask ourselves, what is going on here? Next slide. I would posit that while these root causes of migration, namely economic conditions and violence, are important, they are not sufficient. These are societal or community level issues that have real impacts on individuals, but they impact each individual differently. Not everyone in a community migrates or has migration intentions. In fact, Vanderbilt University data for the region showed that less than 1/4 of all Central Americans have migration intentions. That is still a lot, but is far from all. For that reason, we have been looking at a more nuanced situation, especially at the individual level. To do this, we borrow the social ecological model from child development that breaks the phenomenon down into more digestible pieces. The CDC, the US Agency for International Development, and others use this model to examine the various potential risk and protective factors involved in things like violence or migration at multiple interacting levels: individual, relationship, community, and societal. I will refer back to this model as instructive for our discussion on migration. Next slide. So what did we learn when we used this model? Well, as a part of our work evaluating violence prevention programs in Honduras that provides cognitive behavioral therapy, life skills training, and mentorship, and was funded as a part of the foreign assistance budget I referenced earlier, we looked at what happens at the individual level with violence involvement, either as a victim or a perpetrator. We did this both among youth in general and those in jail. Here I show the results for youth in the general population as an example. As we can see where there's an asterisk in the bottom left-hand corner, we found that there is support for the idea that an increase in the extent to which an individual is able to navigate to resources in order to cope with challenges, or this idea of resilience, is associated with a decrease in violence involvement, and even more so than other common protective or risk factors. In other words, teaching someone skills for planning, managing stress, dealing with adversity, and providing them with resources and teaching them how to find resources, such as an adult mentor, reduces their risk of violence involvement more than things at other levels of the model, like how close-knit their neighborhood is or whether or not they have a job. Next slide. We did something similar for jobs and migration intentions. Here we evaluated a program that sought to increase income-generating opportunities for youth in high-crime areas. The results shown here demonstrate that the program had a positive result and consequently lowered youth migration intentions overall. But when we look closer, we see two things. First, we see where individuals in this particular group who were employed were more likely to have migration intentions than those who were unemployed. This is counterintuitive given the prevailing thoughts on root causes, where employment is thought to reduce migration intentions. But it is also instructive given that among this at-risk group, those most in need, and hence with higher migration intentions, cannot afford to not have a job, even if it is just a few hours per week. This tells us that it's not just having a job, but having a quality job that matters, especially when you consider that underemployment in Honduras is 63%. So we can assume that many of these are not high-quality jobs. But the lesson here is also that individuals with high resilience had lower migration intentions than individuals with low resilience, no matter their employment status. This means that some individuals might see migration as the only way to improve their situation, while their more resource counterparts may have sufficient support to cope with adverse experiences, such as unemployment or underemployment, thereby reducing the drive to migrate. In short, we found that not just jobs, but quality of jobs, coping mechanisms, and dignity of work matter in migration intentions. And we see here where resilience again plays a role in mitigating another root cause of migration. By digging below the root causes, we were able to see individual characteristics and relationships that play an important role in migration intentions. Through the various programs we've evaluated, we are learning more about how to promote things like resilience, namely through programs that support and build positive relationships, empower self-determination, and develop a sense of belonging, all a part of the integral human development approach. Next slide. So to close, what does this all mean? First, the youth in the programs we've evaluated are given assistance and tools to build the resources or navigate to the resources that they need. Our research shows that these programs work. For those that find work through these programs, the work is often better than what they might have had previously in terms of pay, hours, stability, or location. This offers a chance not only for an increased income, but for the increased dignity of work that we look for in integral human development. In violence prevention programs, similar interventions reduce the risk of violence involvement and therefore the risk of migrating. USAID, through the Foreign Affairs budget, is currently working to bring programs that build resilience and other soft skills to scale in the region through collaboration with local NGOs, businesses, and government agencies. I am hopeful that the current budget proposals will continue to support this expansion, taking into account the nuance that I've mentioned. At the same time, as Eduardo showed, forces are at play at the political and societal levels, and policies and programs must work to create the conditions for individual flourishing that combat what we call structural hopelessness, to borrow a term from our partners in the Regional Human Rights Working Group. In our research, up to 25% of respondents don't see a good future in their home country. This is related to migration intentions, but it is different. This is not impacted by having the money, connections, time, or other resources to plan to migrate. It means that a quarter of the population doesn't see hope in their future. This structural hopelessness arises from a lack of agency to do anything about the combination of the economic situation and governance issues, such as endemic corruption, poor services, lack of trust in institutions, and impunity that have not improved despite the numerous transitions over the past decades, as Eduardo showed. So what can be done about this? Things like long-term, quasi-international efforts to combat corruption can and should be instituted, potentially at a regional level, by the US and other cooperators as a precondition for trade preferences or any direct assistance to governments. So to close, while the first two responses to why did you migrate or why do you plan to migrate are inevitably security and employment, we need to advance our thinking from these proximate causes to another level of root cause, basic dignity and agency. A holistic approach such as integral human development addresses these issues. Practically speaking, out of all the things the United States, regional governments, businesses, and civil society can do, the most important is to continue to build individual resilience and confidence in governments. I think that is our challenge for the next decade, and to do it consistently. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nuñez and Dr. Hare. Those were both extremely interesting presentations. We're going to go into our question and answer period here now. So we have a few questions here. Mr. Nuñez, I'm going to send the first question over to you. The first question is, what can or should regional governments do about this issue? I know you have a lot of experience working with regional governments. So what can or should they do in response?
Thanks, Liz. This is a pretty good question in perspective of current situation and next steps. I think two or three, I want to share with you two or three ideas about it. First, the complex regional and national context demands different capacities, and not only capacities, also attitudes from our governments, but also from the main non-state actors, such the private sector or civil society organizations. In this perspective, we need better government, but also better economic and social actors. The first thing is to recover the disposition and capacity for political and social dialogue. We cannot think that governments, for its own way, unilaterally, are going to be able to change all the things or all the challenges. It demands broad and stable political and social agreements over time, more than the political or constitutional cycles to government. The strategies that can transform economies, reduce insecurity, reduce irregular migration, or improved governments are not short-term. We need stable actors, political and strategic vision, safety space of dialogue between government and society, and key agreements on strategic reforms agenda. A second idea is that it's necessary to improve the quality of our institutions in Central America. The COVID-19 pandemic gave us relevant information about the health status of our institutions. We have long believed that more money is required to improve our services and public policies. That's it, the key idea in the last 20 years. We have no money to do where I need to do. We need more taxes, for example, fiscal pacts or fiscal agreements between economic actors, civil society, and governments. But in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the three countries in the Northern Central America increased their budgets between $2 and $2.8 million, a lot of budget for Central American countries. And even so, the health services did not function properly, and the mitigation measures of the economic effects of the pandemic also don't work. What lesson give us this situation? We not need only more money, we need more and better institutions. We need a strong institutional reforms agenda. Thanks.
All right, Dr. Hare, next question is for you. You mentioned what the U.S. government is doing. What can businesses, civil societies, and individuals in the U.S. do?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think there's a few different things that can be done among all three. And I see that there's a couple of good questions in the chat box about this. I think, especially among industry, I think there has been, especially at the beginning of the Central America Dominican Republic Free Trade Agreement, that's now at least 15 years old. There were certain trade preferences that were given to the region that really helped boost manufacturing, and you see that through the spread of industry in the region. And I think that kind of investment needs to continue and can continue. And I think that the private sector really can collaborate, especially with the private sector in Central America, through things. There's a new recent development called HUGE, which stands for Honduras, United States, Guatemala, and El Salvador Business Council, that really seeks to build these partnerships to mitigate the risk for businesses working in the region. The second thing is part of what the United States Agency for International Development has been doing is looking to partner with private sector groups to do what are called global development alliances. So looking at specific areas that any kind of private sector business might be good at, whether it's law, education, other services, private schools, and they look to partner with those groups and really and ask the private sector to have value add for ongoing programs, or to propose their own programs that potentially could align with goals in the region, both of local governments, local civil society, and the Agency for International Development. And I think, too, I think one of the important things is especially for private sector and for all people, obviously my opinion is a little bit biased, but is to continue to invest in research and really understanding these causes. Because I think part of where we've come in the past 20 years, at least on our understanding of this, or at least since I've been involved in looking at this, we've come a long way at figuring out what's working and what's not working, and both our foreign direct investment and our aid to the region. And I think that kind of research and learning has a really good return on investment for the future. And I think finally on the individual front, I think there's a lot that individuals can do. I mean, being here and learning about the issue and going deeper is really important so that we're all fluent on the issue and can go deeper maybe than what we see in the news. But then we can also take the next step if we're so inclined to advocate. And I think there's a lot that can be done in advocacy, as I mentioned, the different pathways of things like expanding temporary visas. That's something that the United States has done since the Bracero program after World War II with Mexico. Hundreds of thousands of Mexicans, last year alone, 240,000 Mexicans came to the United States to work under a temporary visa and then went back to Mexico, compared to only 5,000 from Central America. And as I mentioned, that number doubled. Just a couple of weeks ago, they opened up another 5,000 or 6,000, which is great, but it's still 11,000 for 3 different countries for millions of people is not going to do the job. But we can talk more to our leadership about the benefits of those kinds of programs, especially in these jobs in agriculture and other industries that would go unfilled otherwise, and where there's a real demand. And finally, I would say, being educated and understanding and then advocating for maintaining and continuing to increase the foreign assistance budget. I think it's much belied, and people have a lot to say about it because it's money that's leaving the United States. But I think there's plenty of it, even just looking at the enforcement versus development assistance and what could be saved there over in a year if it's $26 billion on enforcement. But then also, there's our military leadership comes out and says this in different contexts all the time, that they would much rather spend $1 in aid to save $10 or $100 in military expenses down the road. So I think there's a lot that we as individuals can do and advocate for on that front, and using those numbers and that math to make the case to people.
Thank you. Mr. Nuñez, next question is for you. When we're talking about integral human development and what can we do on an individual level, can you speak to the level of education in the region, the level of education and quality of education that the youth in Central America are receiving?
Of course, this is one of more important challenges in Central America. In general, with the exception of Costa Rica and recently of Panama, the educational systems, basic systems, the primary and the
I think maybe we lost Eduardo, but I can take over for a second on that one. I think that to answer the question most specifically, the average education in a place like Honduras, and I think it's pretty similar in Guatemala and El Salvador, is the 4th to 6th grade. Depending on if you're in a rural area, it tends to the 4th grade. If you're in an urban area, it tends towards 6th grade, which is still very low. And I think we see that that kind of investment is something that isn't prioritized, quite frankly. And I think that's something that the regional governments and civil society and others can put pressure on to say that this is something we really need to focus on. One example would be in Guatemala, where at the end of last year, they are actually looking to take money out of the education budget to pay the per diems of the members of Congress, a direct swap in the budget lines. And that met public resistance, and they backed down from it, which was great because civil society watchdogs were keeping track of the budget and watching out for those kinds of things. So I think there's a real need to keep a focus on keeping people in school, but then also, just like jobs, of what's the quality of the jobs, what's the quality of the education. And part of the time that I did spend in the region, I was in a school. And I can tell you that just being in a school doesn't mean you're learning anything. I think that's true in the United States too. But really teaching the skills that are necessary, the critical thinking skills that are necessary, some of the things we talk about in terms of the life skills, the planning, the good decision making, those kinds of soft skills versus the rote math and writing and reading and writing that tends to be taught in the region. So there's a long way to go on that. It's a good question because it is a critical issue.
All right, all of the questions are going to continue to come back to you. We think we lost Eduardo. He is actually presenting from El Salvador, from a hotel in San Salvador. So he may be able to get back on, but if he does not, Dr. Hare, all the questions are coming to you. So the next one is, you mentioned some regional security initiatives that had been in place at one point. One of the questions is, what can the U.S. government do to influence policies in Central America without being overbearing?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because there is a long history. I mean, I think Eduardo briefly mentioned it. There is a long history of obviously colonialism from the Spanish, going back hundreds of years, all the way through a sort of neo-colonialism by the United States, starting in the middle of last century. It's a very real issue. It's a very sensitive issue. And so I like the way the question was phrased of, there is a way that we can be helpful without being colonialist again. And I think that goes back to recognizing in some ways a little bit of our responsibility for what's happening in the region right now. And that goes back to the fact that the Cold War in Central America fought on our behalf, at our behest, and with our financing, was a very hot war for Central Americans. It was very real. It was in their backyards. It was their family. And so I think recognizing that and recognizing the fact that the first waves of migrants started to leave the country during that time, during the 80s, in El Salvador and as well in Guatemala from the 70s to the 90s, that was a main factor that was pushing people out of the country. And then those individuals made it to the United States, many of whom grew up on the streets of Los Angeles, and needed to find protection because they were all alone as young adults in Los Angeles, where there was already a lot of crime and violence and gangs. And so formed their own gangs. And then those gangs were individuals from those gangs were found by the police, committed a crime, maybe didn't, and were then deported back down to Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras as well, and started their gangs or kind of revived their gangs there in the region. And then that, given all the regions, all the issues that Eduardo mentioned, those gangs really flourished in the region. So we need to recognize to a certain extent our ownership of that problem. But we also need to do it hand in hand with the regional governments. And I think the challenge right now is the fact that, and again, Eduardo made reference to this, but the authoritarian nature of the governments in the region right now is a worrying trend. I think we see this especially in what the administration is trying to do now in terms of engaging with leaders in the region. But really, the challenge, most to put a finer point on it, is someone like Juan Orlando Hernandez, the president of Honduras, who is not himself implicated or is implicated by association in federal criminal proceedings for drug trafficking in a case that involves his close associate and his brother. And so how can the United States really use him as a good interlocutor in Honduras? I think is an open question, and we're seeing that now as Vice President Harris and Special Envoy Zuniga engage with the region, is who are the real actors and groups that they can trust and work with in the region. And that's, I think, what they're tending to find, and they've known this too, especially from Biden's time working on the region under Obama, is that there are a lot of good civil society groups that the US government can engage with and work with on the region, especially to promote accountability and transparency.
Okay, we have time for one last question. Someone would like to know, are you sharing this information with those in the US government who are right now working on developing policies to address this issue? Are there ways that you're sharing your research and getting this information to them?
That's a great question. And the answer is yes. Both Eduardo and I actually work primarily with US government funding and funding especially that comes from the Agency for International Development. And so our first actual stop with a lot of this information, this data, and even in all of our work in data collection is actually very closely aligned from elaborating our surveys and our questionnaires, working hand in hand with government agencies, with the embassies and the USAID missions in each of these countries, as well as their colleagues in Washington. So our first stop is always meeting with them, discussing with them, and then the first readout, even early data and analysis is with them before we can even actually talk about it publicly. And one example would be just last week we did a public webinar as well on some of this information and invited U.S. government officials to join us. And actually, Representative McCall from Texas joined us in that conversation, and a representative from the State Department as well. So we tried to make this as as user friendly as possible and get the information out. And it's cyclical too. We've working on analysis and presenting and talking about these data that we have here. And in the meantime, we have a team in the field right now in Honduras collecting another national survey that we'll have results from. And again, that's all working hand in hand with the US government. And then I think the big challenge for us as academics and researchers is to make sure then that information gets back into the hands of civil society and governments in the region as well.
Great. Mr. Nuñez, so glad to see you back. You made it back just in time for us to say thank you to you. So we're just running out of time. Thank you again so much to you, Mr. Nuñez, and you, Dr. Hare, for sharing your time with us today and for your continued commitment to this important issue. The World Affairs Council is able to offer these types of programs thanks to the support of our membership. If you enjoyed the discussion today and you would like to stay involved, please consider becoming a member of the World Affairs Council of St. Louis. Information on how to become a member has been pasted into the chat bar. If you enjoyed this program so much today that you'd like to watch it again, or you'd like to explore other programming by the World Affairs Council, please find us on YouTube. The link to the World Affairs Council of St. Louis's YouTube page is also pasted in the chat. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.